Good morning, everybody. I'm sure most of you haven't ever heard of PIETA House, which is a wonderful service for the prevention of self-harm or suicide. And I'm sure the majority of you have never heard of Joan Freeman, except probably for two people here, my husband and my sister. And it's funny, I was behind two ladies earlier on, and I overheard them talking, and one said, "Who's Joan Freeman?" And the other one said, "I haven't a clue." And it was on the tip of my tongue to tip them on the shoulder and said, "Well, actually, she's a very attractive young woman who works for PIETA House," but I didn't. It was remarkable listening to Father Robert there when he spoke about that everybody has a story. Because I think for you to understand about PIETA House, the miracle of PIETA House, you need to hear my story, and unfortunately it involves a little bit of my life. I was born in the late 50s in Dublin, and normally I would say I was born in the late 70s, but because there's a few priests floating around here, I thought I'd better not. I was born into a very typical Irish Catholic family. I was the youngest of 6, and at that stage, when I was a year of age, we emigrated to England because of financial difficulties. And if there's anybody English here, please forgive this, but my mother thought that when we landed in England that we would come across a land of pagans. So she barricaded our house with statues and crucifixes, and we had the Stations of the Cross going up the side of the stairs. And at the very top of the stairs, there was a life-size statue of St. Teresa. And when I was older, I used to get up on the tip of my toes and kiss the tip of her nose. But you can imagine that an awful lot of people who were guests in the house would have got an awful fright when they ran up to go to the loo and found her standing outside the door. So we were, as I said, we were a very typical Catholic Irish family. You know, the rosary every day, Mass on Sunday, benediction. And I suppose on St. Patrick's Day, I can always remember my parents, we all at Mass, and they singing, "O Glory St. Patrick," and crying, wanting to go home. And 11 years later, we did go home. We came back to Dublin with 2 extra siblings attached. And why I'm telling you this about this very typical Irish Catholic upbringing is because it never dawned on me to question or challenge my faith. And even though growing up, I was a rebel in many, many ways. I was a proper brat, in fact. A bit like, again, the previous speaker. But I never rebelled against my faith. I just continued going to Mass and going to confession. And I suppose this continued on right through up into my 20s, when I fell in love with the most attractive man, Pat, and married him. My faith and my religious practice continued, and we had 4 children in 5 years. We eventually found out what was causing that. And I remember someone saying to us, you're the pets of the Pope, because we were having babies one after another. And again, all this time, you know, if anybody had asked me, what was your relationship like with God? I would have said, what do you mean relationship? And if anybody had said to me, well, what do you think God is like? I'd have said, well, I can see him as having long white hair, a long white flowing beard, and that he usually goes between 2 emotions with me. One is an emotion of benevolence, and the other one would be of disappointment. So with the 4 babies, I stayed at home. I had the privilege of staying at home. And while I was at home, this is when I studied. I studied and became a psychologist. And then at night time, my husband would come home, and I would go and do a few voluntary hours for Accord, which then was called CMAC, the Catholic Marriage Advisory Council, where, you know, I gave a few voluntary hours for people who had marital problems. And again, never ever did I question or challenge my faith. And it wasn't until when I was 40 years old and my father died, and when he took his last breath, I stopped believing in God. And I know that sounds very dramatic, but that is actually how it happened. And I remember feeling so empty and so bewildered. And I went to a friend who happened to be a priest, and he said, look, this could be just a symptom of your grief. He said, keep practicing your faith, keep it ticking over. And I did. And I kept it ticking over even though I felt nothing. And I kept it up, I suppose, for my children as well. And it was about 5 years later when my faith exploded into my life again. In the meantime, I'd opened my own private practice. I was able to see people who were in marital trouble or had the usual things of life, bereavement, maybe teen relationship problems, all the different problems that face humans. And I was able to do this during the times that my children were at school. And yet there was a couple of groups of people that I couldn't help that really and truly I found huge difficulty. One would be the young people who might self-harm, and the other group of people who were suicidal. And the first thing I would do, I would send them off to their GP as quickly as possible and feel a great, sense of relief. And to be honest, I thought anybody who was suicidal was dysfunctional and certainly came from a dysfunctional family. I suppose I felt like that right up until my own sister died by suicide. And then my whole reaction to suicide, my understanding of suicide, changed literally overnight. It's funny, you have to actually go through something as traumatic as suicide before you have a clear understanding of it. And looking back, I see that people who have been bereaved by suicide fall into two groups. The first group are those who retreat and lick their wounds, and they keep the secret of suicide as a very guilty burden. The other group, which is what I was, they absolutely need to absorb and find out every single thing they need to know about suicide. In those days, now we're talking about 7 years ago, even though the internet was around, I didn't have it in my own home. So after my sister died, every single day, I would book an hour in the library, and I'd trawl the internet. I'd type in the word suicide, and I wanted to know everything there was about suicide, why it happened. At the same time, I was also looking at every religious book just to find, had my sister gone to heaven? And what I found out was that, and the awful thing that I found out was that her death could have been prevented. And when I found this out, I remember one morning waking up and decided not to get out of the bed. I didn't see the point. And yet I was still surrounded by the books on suicide and also the religious books. And because I had nothing else to do, one day I read this book, and it was called The Seven Sorrows of Mary. And I don't know why I had it there, because I remember being given this book 5 years earlier when my father died by this nun. And I read the book from cover to cover. And one of the chapters, one of the sorrows, was of the Pieta. That wonderful, wonderful image of the Blessed Virgin holding the broken, dead body of her son. And there's a lovely story behind that. This wonderful sculpture by Michelangelo is very symbolic, because he made Mary's body bigger than that of Jesus. He made her shoulders broad, her lap very deep. And really this was so that she could hold and embrace her son's death. And I suppose at that moment when I read this, one of those sort of little light bulbs went on. And I thought, we need a Pieta to help the people in our community, to hold their broken lives in our community. And so that was the first thought and first concept of PIETA House. So for about 3 years after that, I mean, it was quite insane, really. The first thing I did was I got up the next day, went down to a local auctioneer. I said, do you know anybody rich enough who can give me a house? And I told him why, and he said, listen, don't be an idiot, go and start a charity. And everything fell into place. And when I look back now to where I am, I think I have been in training all my life for this. So we got the house, and the person paid the deposit on this friend, the relative of our family, paid for the deposit of the house and paid for the first 3 years, in fact, of the mortgage. Then I needed a bit of a working capital, and I'm sure you're all wondering, where was my poor unfortunate husband in all this? Well, besides him being down there somewhere, he was beside me all the way. And in fact, I remember one morning during breakfast, I needed to tell him that we needed to borrow a few bob. So I said, sweetie, we need to borrow a few bob. And I said, we in fact need to borrow about 130,000. And Pat was just smiling at me and chewing. He was eating a bit of toast at the time and nodded. And I said, the bank's willing to give us a few bob, but they want to use our house as collateral. And he continued to smile and nod. And it wasn't for some time that I realized he was in fact choking on his toast. So that really was the start of it. 3 years later, on the 19th of January 2006, we opened PIETA House. We had a staff of 6 at the time. We had 2 part-time receptionists, a lady who looked after the accounts, a therapist, myself, and I made God the manager of PIETA House. As you can imagine, my relationship was somewhat changed with him at this stage. He had a haircut and a beard trim, and his hair was quite dark for some reason. But I knew that I couldn't do this by myself, and that life and death is a very serious subject, and I couldn't do it on my own. So that's why I made him the manager, and we celebrated with Mass, which we do every year since. And what has happened in the last 4 years since we've opened, we have seen over 2,000 people. We have 3 outreach places in Dublin. We're opening in Limerick this summer, because Limerick has the highest rate of suicide in Ireland. And we now have a staff of 30. And our Lord is still the general manager of PIETA House. Now, he's not bad, but for some reason, especially the financial part, he keeps holding on to the beatitude of blessed be the poor. Because every month we're going from hand to mouth trying to find a few bob. This service, which is a wonderful free service of one-to-one counselling for people who are in distress. And let me just add very swiftly here, one of the amazing things we've discovered in PIETA House is that over 90% of people who come to us have not got a psychiatric history. They are responding to a life event. In other words, suicide can happen to anybody. So we've adapted our hours even to help those in crisis. We work until 8 o'clock 4 nights a week, but we're also open over the weekend because 49% of suicides take place at the weekend. It has been an incredible journey. It's been a journey that has made me look at my faith and my relationship with God. It has also made me see that I see God in every person that comes to PIETA House. And I suppose if you think of the 4 years and the over 2,000 people that have walked through the doors. That is equivalent to over 30,000 worth of counselling hours. And those 30,000 hours have heard an awful lot of talking, and have seen an awful lot of talking, and seen an awful lot of listening. It's also seen an enormous amount of crying, but also an incredible amount of laughing. And I suppose essentially it has seen an incredible amount of hope. And if there's anything I can pass on to you today, I hope that you will realise that if you're going through a difficult time in your life, first of all, make God the manager. But that you will see that from a terrible, terrible tragedy, positive action can result. Thanks very much.